carbs, and we don't specify, we don't discriminate if we're talking about whole carbs, high quality carbs, or low quality carbs, refined carbs. In general, in most populations, it's going to be refined carbs. And we're not going to see much of an effect on risk compared to saturated fat. There are other problems with PURE that have been addressed many times. The socioeconomic disparity between affluent countries and poorer countries that they included in the analysis. So specifically with saturated fat, the highest intake was seen in North America and Europe, and the lowest intake in Africa and China, mostly rural populations. So this introduces an obvious potential problem that differences in healthcare and just quality of life in general might affect the results. Now in PURE, they did try to adjust for that statistically in the supplementary data for some of the socioeconomic factors, but to what extent can we correct for that level of disparity comparing Sweden and Canada to Africa and rural China? I don't know. If we compare it to the Harvard analysis, for example, where all of the participants were healthcare professionals, all in the US, it's a much more uniform population, a lot less socioeconomic confounders. So we just have to bear these things in mind and just do the best we can. So that's PURE. Very difficult to conclude anything about saturated fat from PURE. Next, they look at the UK Biobank, which is another large epidemiological cohort, and they summarize their findings. They found no evidence that saturated fat intake was associated with cardiovascular disease, which is true, and we already understand this now. Without looking at specific replacements, we don't expect much of an effect. But the UK Biobank also showed that saturated fat intake associated with higher risk of total death. It's right in figure 1 of the study. They go straight up. They don't mention that in the new narrative review. I guess they missed it. You don't even need to read the paper. It's in the abstract. In fact, it's the only mention of saturated fat in the abstract of the UK Biobank paper. They say lower intake of saturated fat was associated with a lower risk of mortality. I always assume best intentions, so I'm going with they didn't notice this. Okay, the next sentence in the Boogeyman review, let's call it the narrative review, more professional. Their next sentence talks about substitutions. So now we're in business. This is what we want to look at. They say substitution of polyunsaturated fats for saturated fat was associated with a higher cardiovascular disease risk. So reducing saturated fat and increasing polyunsaturated fat was associated with a higher risk. That goes against everything we know. We definitely want to look into that. So here's the study, and this is the part that talks about replacements. So let's look at what they said. Replacing saturated fat with monounsaturated fat or protein was associated with lower risk of death and cardiovascular disease. Replacing saturated fat with starch was not significantly associated with cardiovascular disease, but was associated with lower mortality. Replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, with PUFAs, this is what they mentioned, was not significantly associated with mortality, but was associated with a higher risk of CVD, cardiovascular disease. So this part right here is what they're talking about. And replacing saturated fat with sugar, so refined carbs, was associated with lower total death, but higher cardiovascular disease. So saturated fat looked worse than monounsaturated fats, it looked worse than protein, it looked worse than starch. Even with refined sugar, the replacement didn't look great for saturated fat overall. Lower mortality when we swapped for more refined sugar and less saturated fat. This is the sentence they cited. The rest of the replacements, the rest of the paragraph, they just missed. I'm still going with they didn't notice it, right? Assuming best intentions. Okay, but we have a mystery. Why do PUFAs look worse than this replacement? That's surprising. That goes against everything we know. So we don't want to dismiss this finding. We also don't want to reflexively accept this and dismiss the rest of the field. So we want to understand why we have an outlier. What's going on here? The obvious first thing to look at is source. PUFAs, polyunsaturated fats, can come in fatty fish, nuts and seeds, liquid vegetable oil. Those are generally the recommended sources. Or it can come in ultra-processed foods and junk foods that just happen to contain PUFA oils, polyunsaturated fat oils. So I dug around the data for the UK Biobank population, and this is what they reported. 18% of the PUFAs are coming from recommended sources like fatty fish and nuts or seeds. The number one source of PUFAs was grains, especially refined grains. So baked goods and pastries, that type of thing. Okay, so that makes sense. Now, we want to apply the same level of scrutiny across, right? We also want to look at whether the saturated fat was coming from a quality source. And a chunk of the saturated fat in the UK biobank population was also coming from those same refined grains. So baked goods and whatnot, right? 24% of the saturated fat was coming from those foods. So I would also be cautious about the saturated fat data in the UK biobank. In fact, that might explain why saturated fat looked so bad in the replacements, losing to almost everything. In contrast, if you look at the Harvard analysis, the main sources of PUFA were liquid vegetable oils, nuts, and some animal products like chicken, for example. So that's much closer to what's recommended as healthy sources. And the saturated fat in that population was coming mostly from meats and dairy. We're not saying that the Harvard's analysis is perfect. Nothing's ever perfect. But as we try to make sense of things, as we try to decide how much weight each study has, so we can look at balance of evidence, these are all things that we have to bear in mind. Now, I know there's 1,000 other questions about the source. What if the saturated fat is coming from grass-fed products? What if it's organic? We actually went over the evidence on grass-fed not too long ago, a few months ago. I'll link that at the end of the video. And we have more material coming very soon on a lot of the frequently asked questions on saturated fat. All right? So we have to look at how things are done, not just go by sound bites and bullet points, right? People can do that on social media. People do that on Twitter all day long. In a peer-reviewed publication in a medical journal, we have to expect more. We've got to do better. They have to dig deeper. Okay, next. We're almost done with this section of the narrative review, the section looking at epidemiological studies. And the last part, they look at two Dutch studies, very similar, by the same authors. And here we're going to see an example of the principle of dose that we talked about, right? Comes into play here. So in the first Dutch study, they say saturated fat was associated with lower ischemic heart disease. Wow, what's going on here? We expect not much change in a general population without specifying a replacement. We see a lower risk with saturated fat intake. We definitely want to look at that. So here's the study. And when we look at how much saturated fat they were eating, they were taking in a lot. They stated very clearly, more than 97% of the population exceeded the upper limit of 10% recommended by the Health Council of the Netherlands. So the recommendations in the Netherlands are actually the same, keep it under 10%, same cutoff as in the US. I actually didn't know that. There you go. So this population of Dutch people were almost every single one of them above the dynamic range. In fact, the lowest group, the group eating the least saturated fat, averaged 12% of their calories from saturated fat, and the highest one was getting 18. So they're all in this flat part of the S curve to the right.
So confusing.
So I wouldn't expect much difference in risk at that range. The effect of saturated fat is maxed out for all of them. So any differences we see in this population, I would expect them to come from the other foods people are eating. So if the saturated fat replaces an unhealthy food, yeah, I might expect a bit of a benefit because more saturated fat in that range is probably not going to make a big difference. And if we're raising it at the expense of an unhealthy food, then the net effect might be a benefit. And that's what they found. They saw a benefit when saturated fat replaced carbohydrate, but only low quality, not high quality carbs. They also saw a benefit when saturated fat replaced protein, but only animal protein, not vegetable protein. And finally, they saw a benefit when saturated fat replaced unsaturated fats, which the authors suggest may be due to industrial trans fats that were still present in some of the unsaturated fat food sources like margarines. And if you remember, we said earlier, trans fats are more harmful than saturated fat. So basically the findings of this Dutch study are that for a population that's eating a substantial amount of saturated fat, high range past that dynamic phase, eating even more might not make much of a difference, and it might even help if you're reducing something else that's unhealthy, like refined grains or trans fats. Now, just a little aside, that it's absolutely crucial that we always make this distinction between quality carbs, whole grains, and low quality carbs, refined carbs, junk food, because there is rampant confusion among the public and even some health professionals, even some doctors on this issue. So the last thing we want is to propagate this confusion by talking about carbohydrates in general and not making the distinction between oatmeal and beans and fruit, which are health promoting, and frozen pizza and cookies and crackers and Twinkies, which not so much. The last epidemiological study they look at is another study in the Dutch population, identical, same authors, same range of intake, same issues, so we don't have to repeat the whole thing. So that wraps up the epidemiological section of the narrative review. Now, notice they didn't talk about the Harvard analysis, and it was exactly on this topic they're interested in. And remember, the period of interest for them that they specified was 2010 to 2021. Harvard analysis came out in 2015, smack in the middle. They don't cite it, they don't talk about it. It's like it doesn't exist. It was a reference publication in this field. They haven't heard of it. All right, next, they go into the clinical trials. The first one they mention is Predimed, which is really bizarre because Predimed changed the entire dietary pattern, and there was barely any change to saturated fat intake. So Predimed is not a test of the effect of saturated fat on anything. Next, they look at a trial of blood markers, lipid levels, which they specifically said was an exclusion criterion for their narrative review. I guess they missed this. Okay. And this trial didn't measure total saturated fat intake during the intervention. It was a 4-week trial looking at blood levels of lipids. So it's not what they were looking for at all. And they even say that trial concluded there's no evidence to modify existing recommendations to reduce saturated fat. I have no idea why they included this. It's just bizarre. Okay, the last randomized controlled trial in this section is a trial out of India that gave people different oils. Could be an interesting experiment, but they don't report how much total saturated fat people ate. Was it already super high at baseline? Was it low? Did it increase significantly on either of the groups? This trial doesn't answer that. I'm not knocking the narrative review for including this Indian trial. I think it's probably appropriate to include it. It's just inconclusive either way. Okay, so now we're getting into the last section of the narrative review, which is where they look at meta-analyses and systematic reviews. So this is where the rubber meets the road. And they go over the usual meta-analyses, Siri-Torino, Chaudhuri. You've heard about those now. We already know those don't discriminate. Replacements, they don't even discriminate dose either. So we understand that now. And finally, we get to the point. The analyses that do discriminate between replacements. So they say in the narrative review, several meta-analyses demonstrated that reducing saturated fat and replacing it with PUFAs, with polyunsaturated fats, is more beneficial to preventing cardiovascular disease. A shift toward greater PUFA consumption in place of saturated fat would significantly reduce rates of coronary heart disease. This is one of the meta-analyses they're referring to. It says linoleic acid, that's a type of PUFA, replacing saturated fat was associated with lower coronary heart disease and lower coronary heart disease death. Conclusion, these data provide support for current recommendations to replace saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat for prevention of coronary heart disease.
Oh, man.
This is another one they cite, meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. It looked specifically at increasing polyunsaturated fat in place of saturated fat. And they found consuming polyunsaturated fat in place of saturated fat reduces coronary heart disease events in randomized controlled trials. This suggests that rather than lowering PUFA consumption, maybe as the internet tells us to do, a shift toward greater population PUFA consumption in place of saturated fat would significantly reduce rates of coronary heart disease. So these are some of the meta-analyses the narrative review cites and quotes. In the next paragraph, they bring up the Cochrane meta-analysis, which we touched on earlier in the video. A Cochrane review of randomized controlled trials suggested that replacing saturated fat with PUFA, polyunsaturated fat, appears to be a useful strategy, meaning that it reduced cardiovascular events. Carbohydrates and MUFAs, monounsaturated, was not statistically significant. We covered that in the beginning of the video. There's less trials looking at those replacements. So we don't know with as much certainty if those work or not. Another study reported that replacing saturated fat with PUFAs was associated with significant coronary heart disease reduction, which was confirmed by randomized controlled trials. Here's that study that they're talking about. In general, saturated fat was not associated with coronary heart disease or stroke.
Apparently, great word. But studies did not take replacement into account. Bingo.
When replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fatty acids, then it was associated with coronary heart disease reduction. Back to the narrative review. They continue. Another study found that PUFA-rich vegetable oil in place of saturated animal fats reduces coronary heart disease events. You get the idea. This goes on and on. If we lump everything together, we tend to not see much. If we look at specific replacements, especially PUFAs, we see a benefit of moderating saturated fat under that 10% threshold, give or take, right? So this is old news to you now. Next, they bring up the Sydney Heart trial in Minnesota. Now, we've talked about these trials in previous videos. They basically ask people to bring down the saturated fat and replace it with an unsaturated oil and a margarine. The problem is, back then, these trials were conducted in the 60s and 70s. The margarines had a very high content of trans fats. It's not their fault. It's not bad design. Just back then, this wasn't understood. But we now know this swap probably makes things worse. And on top of that, Minnesota was interrupted because the policies nationwide changed and they lost their subjects. So Minnesota, they pulled the plug on that trial about a third of the way in. But Sydney was concluded, and it's actually included in the latest Cochrane meta-analysis. So we don't need to speculate about the trans fat issues. And the net result of the Cochrane was still a benefit of moderating saturated fat under 10% of calories, even with Sydney in there. So even including trials with massive methodological issues, the big picture is still essentially the same. And finally, they bring up another meta-analysis that looked specifically at replacement with omega-6s, so a specific subtype of PUFA, and did not find a statistically significant difference. Yep, this is not a contradiction. With the Cochrane, for example, we don't have that level of granularity of most RCTs. I think it's okay to say we have less certainty on this level of the subtypes of PUFA. And the rest of it is mainly repetition of things we already looked at. And then the last thing they did was summarize how many of the studies that they found saw an effect of saturated fat. But again, they did some basic errors. For example, the 2020 Cochrane meta, which is the largest meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, and they found a benefit of reducing saturated fat. They put it down as no impact. So basically, it's a negative result. It's just hard to understand this. It's just a lack of familiarity with the field in general, a lack of rigor. But the worst part is that in this analysis that they did in the end, they just counted how many studies found a significant effect and how many didn't. That was it. They didn't account for study quality. They didn't look at how things were done. This is not serious. That's not how you analyze a field. If you want to put a number on it, you can do a meta-analysis. You get an average of the summary of all of the trials put together. You get a confidence interval. There's ways to do it. There's procedures to do that. You don't just go down the list counting effect, no effect, effect, no effect, without understanding what you're looking at.
Here's another example of so many. They cite this analysis and they say saturated fat was not associated with coronary heart disease or cardiovascular disease or mortality, which is true when replacement is not specified. But if you read it, it says the largest prospective study suggested replacing saturated fat with high glycemic index carbohydrates, so that's a marker of low quality carbs, refined carbs, increased risk of cardiovascular disease. But replacement with low glycemic index carbohydrate, like whole fruit, vegetables, pulses, grains, they're referring to whole grains, decreased risk. And more importantly, replacement of saturated fat by polyunsaturated fat conferred the greatest reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease. In other words, the swaps that no one recommends with low quality carbohydrates are not beneficial. And the swaps recommended by every professional health organization in the world lower risk. They put this analysis down as inconclusive, but it basically reflects the bulk of the evidence in this field.
And again, as they go through and put together this list, they miss a ton of big studies that completely fit their criteria. And again, remember, this is supposed to be a comprehensive review by their own definition. So this large analysis, for example, found convincing evidence that partial replacement of saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat decreases risk of cardiovascular disease in men. They're not familiar with this one, not cited. Here's another. Replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fat lowers coronary heart disease. Replacing with linoleic acid, a type of PUFA, lowers coronary heart disease death. Replacing saturated fat with high quality carbohydrates, so whole carbs, lowers coronary heart disease events. They're not familiar with this one either. Not cited, not mentioned. And these are all in the timeline they specified. Here's another one. It's a meta-analysis of 1 million people. Saturated fat is associated with higher risk of death. Inverse association for total fat, MUFAs and PUFAs. So lower risk of death associated with unsaturated fats and total fat. They're not familiar with this one either. Not cited. Another one. Different meta-analysis, also looking at 1 million people total. Diets high in saturated fat were associated with higher mortality from all causes, so total death, from cardiovascular disease and from cancer. Whereas diets high in polyunsaturated fat were associated with lower mortality from all causes, cardiovascular disease and cancer. They're not familiar with this one either, not cited. You get the point. This isn't even an exhaustive list that I just showed you. These are just some big ones that I know of. And I'm not even a lipidologist. Imagine what a specialist in this field who has spent decades working on this can point out. They talk about 4-week trials of blood markers. They talk about trials that didn't measure saturated fat intake. They talk about Paritamed, which is not a test of the effect of saturated fat on anything, but analysis with 1 million people that address exactly what they set out to test in their time of interest, their timeline of interest, they've never seen. So their conclusion of their whole overview of their literature is that saturated fat is not conclusively associated with cardiovascular disease or mortality. And there is no scientific ground to demonize saturated fat. And it can be safely included in the diet to reduce cardiovascular disease and mortality. So you see the blueprint. If you're not familiar with the field, if you don't know what's been done, you set out to look at all the studies in a time period, but you miss half of them. You miss the largest ones. The ones that you don't miss, you're not quite sure how to interpret them. You don't understand the moving pieces. You don't know what you're looking at. Yeah, we end up really confused. This is how they describe their piece. A comprehensive review to critically evaluate the evidence and demystify allegations and misconceptions about saturated fat, to overcome consumers' confusion and guide them in making heart-healthy choices. This is like comedy writing. It's Judd Apatow needs to hire this crew. They are going to demystify things for the public. They're not familiar with the field. They're not familiar with the basic principles to interpret the work, but they're going to tell the public what the field means and why the scientists who built the field and who conducted the work that they then misinterpret, why those scientists are all wrong. It's really good to question things. It's really good to challenge authority.
Ooh, yeah. Got tired of watching that. Whew, just another example why you don't know who to trust. There's all these different voices out there. What to eat, what to don't eat. Eat a balanced diet, idiot. Duh, calories in, calories out. Saturated fat's okay, not okay. It's all about moderation. One more. Yeah. I watched videos like that, I'm like, do you know what? Maybe I should eat more salmon. Makes sense. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. Why? I mean, I like salmon. But how does a regular person just understand all this stuff? With dissenting voices, almost like they're battling. They're almost battling. And the science isn't settled, never is settled, because science shouldn't be settled. And who do you trust? This is difficult. I'm gonna need some bigger weights. There are. Let's push out. Okay. All right. Quick break. Another set. But I'm not bringing you with me this time. I mean, you that's not watching. Whew.